To work. Thank you, Stefan, and thank you to the entire Adobe team for giving us the opportunity to present here today. I'm joining in from Hamburg, Germany, my favorite city in the world, by the way, and I've lived in many places. It's like, I don't know, 6:15 in the evening. And before I go into the slides, little spoiler alert, because we now have all a common understanding, a lot of practice working from home and presenting from home. If you hear a second voice or see a second face during the presentation, that's normally my son Jacob, who tends to crash into my meetings whenever he wants. He's 9 years old. So if you hear a second voice that talks strange, that's my son Jacob, and my apologies for that. So, content powers experience. I think here in this room, this audience, I think nobody would start to argue whether content powers experience. That's more or less common sense. The subheadline here, content as an asset in the enterprise, that's something different. And this is one of the themes that we at Accolins have tried to introduce with many others, that we should start to look at content as an asset of any enterprise. Now, if you look into Wikipedia, what an asset is, pretty interesting to read. In financial accounting, at least, an asset is any resource owned by a business or an economic entity. It is anything tangible or intangible that can be owned or controlled to produce value. So that's an interesting summary of what an asset is. Now, the question is content an asset in the enterprise? And if yes, why? And what are the consequences for us dealing with content at every day in our career? So, quick introduction, and I promise this is the only commercial that you will see in the entire presentation. We Accolins, we are, I think you can call us a dual headquartered company. We were founded in Germany. We're still based in Germany. Our engineering hub is in Germany. But most of our field-facing organization is actually in the US. So we are like a European American setup. We actually have been founded as a spin-off of the German Association of Artificial Intelligence back then. And our goal is to provide an AI-powered content platform to help enterprises to improve on content in many, many aspects. And some of the aspects we are going to touch. If you want to be in touch with me, there's my LinkedIn profile that you can see. I trust that you will find me somewhere and somehow. So let's jump into the topic. And I think this is a good hygiene to try to summarize the entire presentation at the very beginning by saying that my objective, and this is my ambition today on this call, is when this presentation is over, I hope that you will agree that content is an undisputed asset of an enterprise, as I described earlier, in the common sense of what an asset is. Secondly, that technical content is a significant part of any customer experience. Just 5 minutes ago, I heard you saying that we have to break down the silos between technical or product content and marketing content. And there's actually a valid reason for that. Is we users or we customers, we consume content holistically. We don't differentiate between marketing content or technical content or miscellaneous content. We just consume content of a brand without taking into account whether this is a technical or marketing content. And sometimes when I talk to some of our clients and we go down to the aspect what they believe, what the value of their content is that sometimes I feel that technical content sometimes lives in the world that says, yeah, we need to have content because we have a product and the product needs to be described. Be rest assured that technical content is a significant part of any customer experience in today's world. It doesn't always have to be technical content. A product can be a service of some sort, But it's very important for us to point out that technical content is part of the customer experience. Third, let's look at the value of content assets. And you will see an example a little bit later of a real enterprise where our audit came up with the summary that the overall content asset have a total creation value or cost associated of it between 1.5 and 2.5 billion over time. And with that, making the content asset one of the business largest asset pools that they have. And I will go down the detail on why that is and why this is a significant portion of the enterprise asset. And last but not least, we can have as much content as we want to have, but it really comes down to the consumption of content. And sometimes the consumption of content in today's digitized world can be summarized in the following way. Don't be surprised if the total consumption of your content can be more than 1 billion minutes every year. That's a lot of consumption on content, but we will share some of the examples that we have that looks at the details. So 4 components, not more, that I would like you to summarize and remember after the presentation, and let's go right in there. With a customer quote, somebody, Daniela, terminologist at Philips Healthcare, she says, the heart of everything we do is our end customer. We don't want to confuse our customers. We want to have precise, non-ambiguous, clear communication. I think that's a great statement at the very beginning. And let's now look at some of the specifics of content demand and supply. I have to confess, that's a global scale, but sometimes these numbers are not so much front and center of our minds and thinkings. Today, based on the July data, approximately 4.5 billion people globally are connected to the internet. That's about 2/3 of the entire population that we have on this wonderful globe. When we look at the existing content pools, again at a global scale, the most recent count of so-called commercial websites comes with a sum of 1.7 billion commercial websites. That's a lot of websites that you can potentially look at. If you look at the total accumulated pages on the 1.7 billion commercial websites, we have about 60 billion pages that promise solutions to the challenges of the 4.5 billion connected people. Yeah, I have to agree, that's a lot of data points at the very beginning, but this is our audience. Well, we will never reach the entire audience. Even the largest enterprises will not be able to attract the entire audience. But we have a subset of this audience that relates to our business. And it's not always about the connected people or the commercial website or the 60 billion pages. Sometimes it's as simple as sending an email and regarding an email to be a piece of content that is being sent from an enterprise to an end customer or prospect. And as we speak, every day, about 293 billion emails are being sent. Now, I have to agree, a lot of these emails are spams. But if I look into our client base, a client base that has about 10 million subscribers, one of the enterprises, they send about 1 billion emails every year to their client base. And we sometimes forget that every piece of email that we send follows the same rules of content consumption as if somebody would do a Google search and ends up on a piece of content on the website. So content can come in various different formats, but the global audience that we have has become huge. But also the competition on attention has become huge. If you look at the 1.7 billion commercial website and the 60 billion pages, they all compete for attention. Let's look at a real world example. Now that we understand we have 4.5 billion people and 1.7 billion commercial websites, let's look at one of the well-known technical documentation hubs that there exist. Don't have to name the name, but this technical documentation domain, it's actually a subdomain of an enterprise, enjoys about 1 billion visits annually. And the average visit duration is 4 minutes and 32 seconds, which sums up to 4.53 billion minutes of user experience every year. Well, these are stunning numbers. And again, these are real numbers. And you can actually take these numbers of public domain services, but 1 billion visits and 4.5 billion minutes of user experience, that's 75 million hours or 3.124 million days. And if you think that this is probably the largest TechDoc hub, no, it isn't. There's a much larger hub that has about 4 billion visits every month. That equals to 48 billion visits every year. So what I'm saying by that is that, yeah, sometimes we look at these global numbers that I shared earlier, but every TechDoc domain has significant consumption. Probably these are some of the highest consumption metrics that you see. And we need to keep in mind that this is not always about billions of visits. If it's only millions of visits, these millions of visits have the same value in terms of consumption, because sometimes the service that's behind it has a much higher value. Now, if this becomes the prime element of consuming information from your organizations, businesses have to determine and establish metrics that allow them to measure the degree of positive versus neutral or negative amount of customer experience. Every time we come across a piece of content on the internet and we start to read it and we start to consume it, it either leaves a positive experience in our minds, a negative, or a neutral one. But if you look at 4.5 billion minutes, the enterprise is almost forced to really know what the degree of the content pool is that relates to a positive experience versus neutral versus negative, and establishing governance and cadence controls in the business to ensure that over time the neutral returns into positive and the negatives at least move into a neutral position that has real value for every enterprise today. Well, in hindsight, not doing it is just not an option today. Because if the majority of the 4.5 billion minutes of consumption was negative, the likelihood that either the revenue or connected to that retention or NPS metrics will be hurt is very high. And again, I think every enterprise has the same metrics, and it all starts sometimes with just collecting these metrics and making sure that the value of the content and the value of the consumption is part of the overall KPIs that enterprises track every day. So what is a positive engagement then that is connected to the 4.5 billion minutes earlier? So characteristics of content is, yeah, it for sure needs to be findable. On that TechDoc subdomain that I shared earlier, 68% of the traffic on that website is a result of an organic search. So your content needs to be findable, because even if you have the greatest content in the world, if it's not findable, very hard to first create a consumption and a connection, and second, create a positive outcome. Content needs to be clear and easy to read. It needs to avoid offensive or exclusive language. And that has become increasingly more complex as we speak. Inclusivity and many other dimensions has come into content, and you have huge content pools built over time. You got to ensure that you have no offensive or exclusive language in your content. If it is important for your brand or your products or your services, you have to ensure that your content has the characteristics of to be emotionally appealing. And the customer experience that you're trying to deliver is you have to map the tone of voice for your target audience. The words and phrases that you use need to be specific to your enterprise and your needs. the style guidelines for your content types, and the emotions you want to project in your writing. And all of that needs to be governed. Well, that turns into content that works, creates relevant traffic. It does have an impact on conversion, whatever your conversion goals are. It does have an impact on engagement. And it must have an impact on lead generation, lead volume, cost per lead, and revenue. That's a lot of expectation around content, but very, very known. Without focusing on the customer experience that your content powers, you will always fall short of your business goals. And again, these are all sub-elements of the fact that I introduced earlier. Consider content as an asset of your enterprise. There was investments in that content, and there's ongoing investments, but the outcome needs to be a positive experience. There's just yet another aspect of content. The word risk comes into play. I use another example in this context. It's the example of a life science company. A life science company has on average about 500,000 pages on their main domain. On 95% of these pages, they mention their products. Life science companies are sometimes overwhelmed by the creation of content, user-generated content, professionally created content, and all of that has a risk to be published. And all of that is in a highly regulated and in a locally regulated environment. So observing, governing the risk element of content is another valid aspect of content governance. Got to achieve corporate compliance. You need to meet industry-specific regulatory requirements, and you need to eliminate risky content available to employees and to consumers. Great summary from an executive of a retail mortgage bank who says, the risk to any organization are the unknowns. What's sitting out there that's going to cause an issue with regulators? So I think looking at the content risk as an aspect of value is another important thing that we need to take into consideration. So, quick summary, many more slides to come. Content has a cost and value. First question on the left side, how much does a company spend to meet the demand? We want to lay out the investment from a real example. We want to significantly invest in a little control to ensure positive engagement. We got to take into account that content engages with your audience with an outcome. And your content competes for share of voice. Specifically in the tech doc environment, share of voice is another important aspect of observing the performance of your content. Let's say a software business that has a product in place with technical documentation in place. Be rest assured that this content competes with content that sits on other domains such as Reddit, Stack Overflow, or others. And as a brand, you want to ensure that your content is the first choice of your consumers. And last but not least, content creates a measurable experience. So let's look at the example that I mentioned earlier, the cost of a domain and the content. And that's again a real world example from one of the audits that we have done. One single enterprise that has about 1 million content pieces and an average creation cost of a single web page of $1,200. Now, every page is different, and the cost of creation of a landing page is different to the cost of the creation of a blog post, is different to the creation of a 50-page white paper, and so on and so forth. But it's common sense that if you blend it all over, the average cost is about $1,200. So if you have 1 million content pieces created over time, these content assets have a value of about 1.2 billion. That's a pretty big number. I have not yet seen or experienced a chief financial officer or a chief treasurer or a controller of any sort that knew what his number or her number of the enterprise is. But it's a significant number, probably not the average, and we mostly serve Fortune 2000 companies, but all of them have huge content pools created and have huge investment. And while these assets have no representation on the balance sheet and it's scattered across various line items in the P&L, this cost, this committed spend has created content that greatly impacts the customer experience with little to no governance and control. So keep that in mind. There's huge demand and huge consumption. There's a huge cost allocation. And currently, very little governance and control to make sure that all of this shows signs of improvement over time. The hidden cost of content. Now, there's probably content budgets left and right, and marketing and tech to create content. But over time, everyone in your company has become a content contributor. Even consumers, customers, clients have become content contributors. But the cost of creating content is not on the company's balance sheet, not a budget item, not actively managed and controlled. The consequences of not understanding how to improve the ROI of your enterprise content leads to people putting in effort where it creates the least amount of value. A single example is if you look at a piece of content, not knowing what the quality and the impact of that content is, leaves you with very little information whether you should touch and amend this piece of content or not. You need guidance. Great person talking about this, Bruce Saunders. Would have loved to meet him this year, but travel doesn't seem to be an option for many people, including myself. He also summarizes, when they've spent the money, all that they've created is potential value. The creation of content is itself not value producing. It's only the consumption of content. Managing the control of costs, but improve the consumption aspects of content over time. This is the most important aspect. So, uncover the value of your enterprise content. You first need to answer these important questions. How much content do we have? I think I would be surprised to have a meeting with a business executive who could tell me exactly how much content he or she has in his enterprise. The reality is that content comes in various formats. There's many different repositories in every enterprise that contains content. Content is being published on many domains and subdomains. So the question, how much content do we have and how much systems do we have that control content, should be easy, but it isn't easy when you start an audit. Third, what are the main KPIs that we track? And again, companies that will do it holistically have set KPIs around the holistic customer experience and not an isolated set of KPIs for marketing content versus technical content. And last but not least, does content create value and avoids risk? These are just 4 simple steps of audits that you need to put in place to create a starting point. Another customer quote from IBM, being able to connect these dots in terms of cost and value of content as an asset into case closure, either time to resolution, reduction, or case deflection. Those are really our key statements for value of content within the support organization. But once again, the objective needs to be, these are great metrics for a technical support organization. The enterprise needs to come up with a holistic customer experience set of KPIs. Greater efficiency and more choices to add value. Real-time content insight save content contributors a ton of time. Content improvement happens in the first draft, resulting in higher quality content published faster than ever before. all without the need of higher or additional resources. You need to bring insights to where you create content. And when your content reaches the editorial review stage, it's already aligned with your expectations. And that's easier said than done without a governing platform. And the other objective then becomes, if you have savings, you will be able to reinvest savings to improve content even more. Greater bandwidth to produce more content, more time to focus on content campaigns, extend your content strategy to include more strategic elements, such as context, demand, reach, conversion, and evolution. So, time to wrap up. I think there's no doubt and has been no dispute amongst this community on this great show that content is the connection to your audience and consumer. I think what I would hope during the presentation, keep it more front and center of your minds or of our minds, that content has a cost and should deliver business impact. And once again, in the common sense of breaking down silos, that this business impact needs to be governed holistically. Again, the user experience that we all have, we don't differentiate between marketing content and technical content and miscellaneous content. We have an overall experience that is either good or not so good. The creation and maintenance of content should in any case be strategic and not tactical. And that's, I think, the shift that we all have in front of us. I have not yet seen a chief content officer in a company, but I think if we all care about a digital user experience, and this year that we all live in, the year 2020, was the impact of a pandemic. The consumption of digital content has increased quite a bit. We have a lot of first-time users. We have a lot of industries that shifts even drastically than before. So with that, the creation and maintenance of content has to become a strategic asset and not a tactical, departmental asset of an organization. And we call it at Acrolinks the creation of amazing content. And amazing is connected to the fact that content connects to the audience. And that this connection needs to have a positive outcome. It increases the value of the business asset by driving positive business results of engagement, education, and also conversion. So again, going back to the beginning of the presentation, I would hope that we now all agree that content is an undisputed asset of an enterprise. Well, that's a little bit of evangelizing the theme, but I think if we would go out here and start to evangelize it internally a bit more, this asset needs to be elevated. I wouldn't be surprised if over time this asset actually becomes a place in the balance sheet of an enterprise. If I look at content operations today, it reminds me a little bit after the supply chain organization 25 years ago. And supply chain and content operations have similarities. Now, these are not physical products that we ship and buy and sell, but the impact on our business, on our top and bottom line, has increased. Why? Simply put, today we have 4.5 billion people connected on the internet. About 20 years ago, that number was a fraction of the 4.5 billion, right? Today we have about 4.4 million Google searches every minute. That was quite a different number back then. Content is not only consumed, content is also distributed and shared. Like, you look at a piece of content on a website, and in normal cases, you have the opportunity to share and distribute to leverage your reach on social media. content just does not live only on your website, it's being distributed. Content can be as simple as a piece of your user interface that is recognized as content from your audience. Content comes in very many shapes and forms, but it should be seen as an undisputed asset of an enterprise. Second, technical content is a significant part of the holistic customer experience. One of the calls that I had about 3 months ago, I digged into that with a software company, US-based software company. And while the technical documentation organization thought that, well, we have technical documentation because we have product and the product needs a description, somebody else said, well, but technical documentation helps to convert trial users to paying users. And so this was just another moment when I realized technical documentation should actually, in all cases, be seen part of the holistic customer experience, which is not always the case. But that's the second most important takeaway from today's session, at least from my session, but that dear to your heart. Creation and maintenance costs of enterprise content can be between 1.5 and 2.5 billion over time. Please have a conversation with your chief financial officer or the chief controller or the chief treasurer, because I think that's sometimes overlooked. And I think nobody would be surprised if these metrics are very similar in all the enterprises that we and you all work for. And last but not least, the consumption of content is probably the thing that connects all the dots. It is the moment when we identify the piece of content, whether it's the result of an organic search, whether it's the look of a LinkedIn post, whether it's an email that we receive from an enterprise that we react to. That precious moment is important. That moment, that piece of content is not clear if it's not readable, if it's not scannable, if it doesn't match my tone of voice that I expect, if it does contain offensive language and it's not inclusive, it does not have any degree of emotion attached to it if it's needed, that consumption normally turns out to be a negative. And the governance, compliance of this aspect, probably the most important aspect and the most important thing that I wanted to convey in this presentation is, yeah, we can continue to create content. And yes, we can even create this and look at this as an asset. And yes, we will get technical content to be known as part of the holistic customer experience. Can start to measure and track the entire cost of the creation. Got to ensure that most of the consumption leaves a positive experience. That's probably the golden angle to all of that. Last but not least, if you want to learn more, I talked a lot about content audits that we time to time. There's other companies like Croissant's A company. They do it in a very similar or different fashion. If you want to learn more, want to take a pre-register for our ebook around content audit and how can we help to establish a business case about ROI of content, specifically around the consumption of content. There's a little link that you can use. You can contact Accolinks at contact@accolinks.com, or you can send me an invite on LinkedIn, and I will follow up. It was a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present here today and to all of you while it's getting dark here in Hamburg, Germany. And in my home office, I just realized that my son Jacob didn't come in to crash the session. Very pleased about that. I'm at the end of my presentation, a bit early, like 5 minutes early. Stefan, back to you. I have no idea whether people have questions in the Q&A section, yes or no, but for now, it would be back to you.